Hello, and welcome to the ADHD Experts webinar and podcast series from Attitude. I'm Annie Rogers, and I'm extremely pleased to welcome Dr. Ellen Braaten, who will lead today's broadcast titled A Parent's Guide for Managing Language Processing Disorder. Language processing disorder can impact the speed at which a child completes tasks, their facility with language, and their ability to pay attention. All manifestations that may be mistaken for ADHD, but require very different and specific responses and accommodations. In this webinar, Dr. Braaten will explain the common signs of language processing disorder, how it overlaps with and is sometimes mistaken for ADHD, and we will learn about the brain functions and components implicated in language processing. And we'll end with strategies and accommodations to use both at home and at school to help children truly shine. We're so fortunate to have Dr. Ellen Braaten. She is the Executive Director of the Learning and Emotional Assessment Program, LEAP, at Massachusetts General Hospital, and also an Associate Professor of Psychology at Harvard Medical School. Her most recent book for parents is titled Bright Kids Who Can't Keep Up. And I would also like to thank our webinar sponsor today, which is Play Attention. Play Attention will customize your program to improve processing speed and all other cognitive skills that lay the foundation for strong executive function. For more than 25 years, Play Attention has been helping children and adults thrive and succeed. Our NASA-inspired technology and cognitive exercises improve executive function and self-regulation. Each program includes a lifetime membership and a personal executive function coach to customize your plan along the way. There's information on the slide. You can call 1-800-788-6786 or visit playattention.com and use the coupon code ADDMAG0121 to receive $200 off your Play Attention program. So I promise I will turn over the mic in just one moment. I have just a few quick housekeeping items. Those of you who are tuned in to the live webinar, you can download the slides now or at any time by clicking on the Event Resources section of your webinar screen. And if you're interested in the Certificate of Attendance option, please look out for instructions in an email that you will receive about an hour after we wrap up today. If you're listening in replay or podcast mode, please visit attitudemag.com and search for podcast 340. There you will find the slides and the Certificate of Attendance option. Finally, if you like what we're doing here at Attitude and support our mission, educating parents, caregivers, professionals about ADHD and its related conditions, please consider visiting attitudemag.com/subscribe and subscribing to Attitude Magazine. So without further ado, I am very pleased to hand over the presentation to Dr. Ellen Braaten on this extremely interesting and important topic of language processing disorders. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I thought I would start with a little conversation that I had with some parents, and it might sound like a child that you know, and let me just read this to you. So the question was, and I get this question a lot when I tell parents their child is smart or they're competent, the parent will say, well, if he's so smart, why doesn't he understand what I'm saying? And so here's what the parent had said to me. I can see why everyone is frustrated with Dennis because I'm frustrated with him too. I ask him to do something, he stares at me, or it takes him forever to come up with an answer. Whether it's homework, putting on his shoes, taking down a phone message, it's as if I'm speaking Greek. And schoolwork, he gets so excited about writing a history paper. When it comes time to actually do and write the paper, he just sits there staring at the pencil, taking forever to write things down or look things up. If I didn't know him so well, I would think he just didn't care, but I know he does. His dad thinks he's lazy. His teacher thinks he needs to pay attention better, and I'm spending my life yelling at him to get things done. How did we get into this mess? Now, there was a time in my life when I would have thought that Dennis was much like this boy here, who, when you read this cartoon, you'll be thinking, oh, he's a child with ADHD or ADD. And that very well could be the case for Dennis, but it's also possible that it could be other things too. And I have to say, before I get started, I am not a speech and language therapist, as you know from my introduction. I'm a psychologist, a neuropsychologist who evaluates kids for learning and attention and developmental disabilities. And I became interested in the kids who had trouble processing things quickly. They had trouble sort of doing anything within a time frame. So oftentimes these are the kids who are very slow in the processing speed index on the Wechsler scales. If you've got a child who has had a Wechsler, like the WISC or the WACE. But also I was interested because most of my research up until that time had been on ADHD. And this group of kids who had trouble with processing speed, I wondered if some of them had ADHD and some of them didn't. And the reason why this processing speed issue overlaps with language, and why I'm going to be talking about processing speed and how it's important for language processing, is because language happens in a time frame. We don't have forever to come up with an answer. We have to do it in the process of real time and real conversations. Now, let me just review for you just for a second what we do know about ADHD and language. First of all, we know quite a bit about written language in ADHD. There's about a 60% chance that if you have a child with ADHD, they will have a written language disorder. I almost think that for most of the kids with at least moderate to significant ADHD, they will have problems with written language. If we're talking about kids with a language disability, it's almost part of the diagnosis that they will have a problem with written language. And you can see here some of the issues that go along with that. It's not just about writing. It's not just about language. It's also about working memory, planning, organizing what you're going to say. All of these things tend to be difficult for kids with ADHD and also difficult for kids who have language problems. Now, this little graph here shows you that these kinds of disorders and differences and learning differences don't happen singularly. They happen together and they tend to cluster together. So what this says here is that there's a 60% chance that if you have ADHD, you're going to have something else too. This doesn't mean that it's worse than you might have expected. It just means that usually these things kind of run together. And the most frequent things that we see with ADHD are problems with language impairment, dyslexia, which is a reading disability that is considered a language disability because reading is language, and then other things like math and anxiety. You can see how these things are sort of tied together. If you have ADHD and a language impairment, it might make you more prone to be anxious a lot of the time. So that's all this is kind of illustrating for you. Now, although the topic of this is language processing disorder, I have to break it to you that there really isn't such a thing as a language processing disorder. It's not just one thing. It's an umbrella term that is used to describe a lot of different kinds of communication disorders. And so what I have under here is there are things like speech sound disorder, basically having trouble articulating sounds, or fluency disorder, which is what we would call stuttering. And then there are other things like social communication or pragmatic language disorders, which are trouble being able to socially communicate with others that you know. And then there are language disorders, which can include things like problems with expressive language or receptive language. And so all of these, it's really a big umbrella term that just says we're having trouble, or this child is having trouble processing language. I'm going to talk most specifically about the processing word in this term that we often use and how it relates to processing speed. I do think that this is a huge component for lots of kids who have problems with language processing. So let me just take a step back here and talk about what is processing speed. I mentioned at the beginning of my talk that this is something that I became really interested in because I noticed that kids who had slower processing speed, regardless whether they had a primary language disorder, dyslexia, ADHD, that if they had slower processing speed, they tended to have more difficulty in lots of other areas of functioning. And I also found that, for example, let's say we have a child with ADHD and we put in some sorts of compensatory strategies for them. Kids with slower processing speed seemed to need more support. And the same would go for other learning disabilities. So processing speed is something that it's really just how long it takes a child to complete a task in a given period of time. And it's always been thought of as just another executive function skill. And I'm pretty sure that most of the people listening today know what executive function skills are, but it's those skills that successfully allow us to use our intelligence and our problem-solving abilities. We could be the smartest person ever, but if we can't plan ahead, if we can't organize ourselves, we can't use our intellect. And so processing speed was always thought of as another kind of executive function skill. I kind of think of it, though, as its own sort of thing. It's like, think of it as the engine that allows us to use our executive function skills well. So if you've got a faster engine or a more powerful engine, more faster processing speed, it means that you can go faster. So good executive functioning, good organizational skills, good sort of ways of planning ahead depend on how quickly you can do that too. It's not just about how well you can organize, it's how well you can do it in a given period of time. So why is this important for language? Well, I mentioned before that language happens in a time frame. Now, one of the things you might want to think about is, yes, sometimes we process language and we have to use language when we are writing something long and we have a long time to do it. In most classroom settings, that's not the case. And what is important about that processing speed aspect is that it relates, and it's the gap between receptive language and expressive language. So receptive language is the information that comes into our brains. It comes through our visual channels, we hear it, we even can kind of feel it. And, someone touches us, we are getting receptive information, communication. And so that information then has to be replied to or processed. And that's the expressive language, the information that goes out. Between those two things is a time period. And if you're slow at processing information, you're going to be slow to come up with the expressive language that's required, whether it's written, spoken, or sometimes even physical. Sometimes it's a laugh. Sometimes it's a move. Someone tells you to do something, you've got to move quickly. So those are all ways of expressing or communicating. So that speed of processing is really important for a lot of reasons. Now, it's important for that in between the receptive and expressive language, but it's also important even just for the receptive. Some kids are very slow to take in information visually. And what happens to the kids who have this slower rate of language processing? Well, a lot of different things. A lot of things, like I mentioned with Dennis at the beginning of my talk. It's difficulty processing information and speaking fluently or automatically. A lot of times kids who have slow language processing speak slower. Parents get very frustrated because they can't make decisions in a period of time. And it can be as simple as, what do you want for breakfast this morning? And it's either Cocoa Puffs or Fruit Loops, and they can't make up their mind. They'll just sit there like, or what do you want to wear for school today? It's that kind of, in the days when we used to have to go to school, but it's those sorts of very slow processors where they have this trouble kind of like taking in information. It's not just that they're having trouble making up their mind, but the parent has had a question and then they've got to process that question. What does that question mean? And then come up with an output. So along with that, it means problems writing things down on paper. Sometimes it even means slower academic fluency skills. So for example, in a child who reads just fine, but when they have to actually timed read or read out loud. They may be shown to have slower reading fluency skills. They may have trouble sustaining attention to a task, not necessarily because there's a primary attention problem, but because the information is coming in so quickly that the attention is lost. And I like to use an example of if I'm in a room with people who are speaking a foreign language, and I speak a little bit of Spanish, but if everyone else is speaking Spanish at a normal rate, I am going to lose my attention as to what they're talking about. I can hang on to a few words here or there. I can maybe gauge what's going on by their animation and their facial expressions, but I'm going to lose attention. I'm not going to be able to pay attention and be in that situation in a way that I'm communicating fluently. Kids with slower language processing have trouble understanding directions quickly, retrieving information from long-term memory, not because they have trouble with memory per se, but because it takes them a long time to get there. And therefore, they have trouble finishing almost anything. And then surprisingly, in my own research, we found that that kids with slower language processing have trouble with social interactions. And you can't underestimate how important social interactions and language are to each other. Then I also just want to mention too, that sometimes kids who, you might say my child has a language processing problem, they may not have been a problem 40 years ago. But our world is becoming so fast-paced that what was even considered normal or kind of somebody who's just sort of a slow talker, man of few words, actually is becoming a liability in our culture because of how quickly we have to process information. So let me just tell you about these three areas of processing speed that are important to keep in mind. And then we're going to delve even deeper into the verbal processing. So again, visual processing is how quickly our eyes take in information and then relay it to our brain. It can be as simple as something as our eyes dilating to light. It can be something like scanning a room to get a feel for what's going on. People who have trouble with visual processing, lower processing, or car accidents, it can take them longer to find things on a shelf. And think about the sorts of things that kids have to do in a given day in terms of looking up information or finding the right notebook at the right time. And then there's verbal processing, which is our ears taking in information and then also relaying it to the brain. It's much more related to complex problem solving than visual processing is, but it's still important. It's also important to aspects of verbal memory and comprehension of all sorts. And then there's also the motor speed. So each one of these are different aspects of processing speed, but they depend on each other. And when you think about it, there are a few tasks that we have to do that are just purely one or the other. So even motor speed, if I ask a child, if I'm trying to measure fine motor speed, I might have them put pegs in a board. They're still having to use their visual processing as well. So let's talk a little bit more about verbal processing. So again, these are the sorts of things that we tend to find are problematic for kids. They might have difficulty listening to others, struggling to follow through on instructions. They're the kinds of kids who just avoid participating in class discussions whatsoever. Or when they do, they respond very slowly. And again, they have trouble staying engaged during social reasons. And oftentimes these kids can just look kind of tired. Is there anything you can do quickly? Yeah, sometimes I just get tired quickly. And sometimes that's what you might be thinking is like, did you not get a good night's sleep? Why can't you come up with a response to what I'm asking? So there are different sorts of things that we tend to see at different ages when we're talking about verbal processing. In the early grades, they tend to be those sort of preschoolers or kindergartners who just don't seem to follow through on instructions. They can be a little spacey, just need more time to answer questions. But as they move on into the middle school years, they can oftentimes be the sort of child who is very overwhelmed with too much verbal information. They may be that man or girl or woman of short words or short responses. They may have trouble staying focused during social activities and may need a lot more time to respond in conversations. And then sometimes by high school, what we find is a child who, even when he knows the right answer, he's hesitant to give it, doesn't participate in class discussions, and sometimes now has an additional sort of emotional component to their language processing, which is anxiety or maybe even a little bit of depression because they're frustrated that they're not performing at a rate that they wish they were. And these sorts of things, like can't keep up with the pace of lectures or makes grammatical errors, are common for high schoolers with verbal processing problems. And academically, what we see in the early grades is sometimes they're slow to learn different sorts of academic tasks like reading, even though they might not be meeting criteria for a reading disability, a formal disability. It might just be a little bit slower, more apt to become distracted during academic tasks. And the same thing goes for middle school, slower for reading, especially when it relates to fluency with basic math facts or retrieving information from memory. You can also see that I have here that there can be inconsistent in their performance, that sometimes the task that they're asked to do, they can do quite easily, and at other times, just because of the way the task was asked, or because there is less time to do it, they don't do as well. So parents complain and teachers complain that they're inconsistent. And then in high school, where we see the biggest problem with language processing is in things like taking notes in class, paying attention in class, and then formulating and expressing ideas and rating, particularly on timed tests. So speech and language therapists would categorize most kinds of language disorders when we're talking about meaningful language disorders. I'm not talking about poor articulation or stuttering, for example, in three different sorts of categories. One is expressive language, the other is receptive language, and then a mixed receptive and expressive. Some kids have a great ability to understand what's coming in but can't get it out. Some kids can actually be quite talkative, and you think that they are very adept with language, but they're actually not receiving it or not processing or understanding it at a level that you might expect. And then most kids tend to have problems with both of those things. If you think your child has a problem with language processing, the best thing you can do is to get a good evaluation. I'm going to give you some different ideas about what we do and what we can do to treat problems with language processing, but you really want to be very specific about where is it that your child is struggling. Is it in a processing speed issue? Is it in working memory? Is it in just receptive language? Is it vocabulary? Is it social communication? Because that is super important to understanding where to intervene. And I've got some ideas here about where to go. You are entitled to an evaluation through your school system, but you can also go privately. And speech and language therapists and neuropsychologists, school psychologists, are equally good at least having the first pass at this. With significant language problems and they have not had an evaluation by a speech and language therapist, I would refer them to a speech and language therapist. And the same goes the opposite. If a speech and language therapist sees a child with other neuropsychological issues that seem to be impacting speech, they will usually refer out for a broader evaluation by a school psychologist or a neuropsychologist. So they are the ones who are going to treat the specific problems with speech and language. Now, one other thing I mentioned before, but I think it's important to mention now, is that over 40% of kids who have an impairment in language at age 5 will have some additional kind of psychiatric disorder by age 12. Now, that can include things like ADHD, for example, but language impairment impairs you in a lot of different other ways. If you can't express yourself, you're more at risk for having anxiety or depression. It just goes without saying because you're not able to communicate, and communication is how we relate to one another. A couple of little quick explanations of the kinds of kids that I tend to see who have sort of slow processing speed and language problems. The first category of child that I see is a child who's sort of Mr. Chill. Again, that sort of child who's slow to respond in conversations, but doesn't seem to care, is fine, just being sort of thought of as sort of a real chill sort of kid. And then there's a sort of child that I kind of consider Mr. Anxiety. So that weak processing speed causes them to be anxious. It causes them to have trouble communicating with others. And when they try to express themselves, they tend to shut down when they aren't understood. Teachers who value quickness and perfection aren't typically a good match for these kinds of kids. And then there's another category of child that I see that I call the lost child. And it's a sort of child who's never at the right place or the right time. You've told them to do something. They didn't quite get it, but they're also not misbehaving. They're just sort of lost. So they don't tend to be anxious nor sort of chill. They tend to be more oblivious as to what's going on. And sometimes they could be thought of as not very bright. What happens, I think, with a lot of the kids that I see is sometimes that lost child in second grade becomes the anxious child in sixth grade, and then sort of the Mr. Chill kind of child in high school. And sometimes that's a good thing, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes, like I say, they wear this as a badge of honor, thinking that it's fine that I am not quick or not fast. That's fine. Like everybody else just needs to chill out. And they don't tend to then become the person that they're capable of being. The other issue that comes up here too is that there's this emotional consequence of slow language processing. You're processing information slowly. We know from my research that that leads to problems in daily life, that parents complain more, that things aren't going well at home. It leads to more peer problems. Well, what happens when we're stressed in daily life? We have low self-esteem. We are more likely to become depressed and anxious. Those emotional difficulties have consequences. We become perfectionistic, or we become low motivation, like that Mr. Chill child that I was seeing that might be okay with it, but may not be okay with the fact that he's not understanding a lot of what's going on. And so what happens when we have those sorts of psychological consequences, those things cause us to slow down even more, which cause more problems in daily life. And so the circle just keeps on going. So what can we do then? Well, let's talk a little bit about how to support kids with slow language processing. There really aren't any treatments that help somebody actually talk faster, but speech and language treatment can be very helpful in treating the underlying language disorder. So that's very important. Again, I can't tell you strongly enough to get an evaluation. Don't just go with, somebody told me he's got a language processing disorder, and so we want to know what to do. You have to specifically know what is it in the language system that is causing these sorts of problems. Medication can sometimes be helpful if a child has ADHD, but it's not if language processing and processing speed is the primary symptoms. But other sorts of treatments for learning disabilities are helpful. All of these things happen together. Remember, I say a lot of these things coexist with one another. So you want to make sure you are treating very adequately all the things that we know how to treat. And then I've sort of come up with these, what we call the 3 A's of processing speed: accepting, accommodating, and advocating. And so accepting means to accept and know what the problem is. Accommodating is changing the environment to meet that child's needs. And then advocating, which is helping a child understand his or her neurocognitive profile, language abilities, so that they know when things are going too fast for them, so that they can communicate with a teacher and say, I didn't get what happened in math class today because it went too fast for me, or I didn't understand what you were saying because the way you said it didn't make sense to me. Now, we can't expect kids to do that in third grade, but we can start to instill that in them. And first of all, by being good advocates for them ourselves. Now, so what shouldn't be done? I always think that this is a good thing for me to mention, that yelling, screaming, shouting, it doesn't generally work, and it definitely doesn't work well, even though it's the first thing most of us do when we are frustrated with a child. Also, referring to the child as lazy. I still hear this to this day. parents use terms like lazy, and they're not being mean, or it just feels like that to them. They'll just say, like you can't even come up with a reason why he didn't get his homework done. Well, the child didn't get the homework done, and then also having trouble processing the language, using expressive language to express himself. So we use terms like lazy, for example, which aren't very helpful in the least. And that's another reason why I encourage parents to get a good evaluation. Because without a good evaluation, without a really specific label, kids get other labels like lazy, or doesn't try hard enough, or could be better if you only paid attention more. So that's why it's important to know, no, you know what, he's not lazy. He just has trouble with receptive language and working memory, for example. So what can we do at school, though, to support these kids? Well, we can rely on more than just the language system by using things like nonverbal signals. Teachers do this. Good teachers do this automatically. They stand by the desk of the child who's having trouble. They put their hand on a child's shoulder. They tap, to get somebody's attention. Kids with language processing issues are having a particularly difficult time now with remote learning because they don't have other ways to process information in the environment. So it's just something to really think about. I don't know how much longer we'll be doing this kind of learning, but if you have a child who's having difficulties, get an evaluation, start to advocate yourself for your child, because they are not getting enough of that language input right now in order to maximize their potential. Also, think about what's in the room itself. Simple, uncluttered visuals are helpful. The less a child has to process, the better they can process what's right in front of them. Giving children extra time to respond to conversations, allowing them to do things like asking questions after class, or being able to email the teacher after class, using multisensory learning like books with audio tapes, and also giving students an outline of the lesson beforehand. So as they're listening to the teacher give a lecture, they can see it on the page, they can add to it as they need to, but they don't have to make sure they get everything done at the, down on paper. And reducing that need for multitasking helps all of us process everything more quickly. Just think about it, even if you don't have a problem with language processing, if 3 people are asking you something at the same time, you can't adequately respond to any of them. And then I also have here recess and downtime. This is something that's also been neglected just historically over the last few decades of our educational system. And now with COVID, I think kids are getting either too much downtime and not enough recess, not enough rejuvenation time. It's just something to think about. And then we need to think about language processing with friends. And slow processing speed and language processing speed can take a toll on friendships because kids are slower to pick up on social cues. They can miss the point. They sometimes can even have sort of stilted language because it takes them a long time to figure out a response. Even in simple things like pretend play, they might lose track of what's going on or lose track of the conversation, and other kids may become frustrated with them. And then ask them to tell a story. What did you do at school today? Or, what did you see on the movie that you went or you just saw? They'll have trouble sort of organizing their thoughts in relaying that. And again, that causes people to say spit it out, just tell me the story. That becomes not a positive social interaction. And then even things like reacting to jokes or failing to respond to people when it's appropriate for them to respond can also be difficult. And then especially when conversations are emotionally charged, kids with slower processing and language issues can have more trouble coming out with something because they're doubly then anxious. So some other strategies are things like, and these will be in your slides, are having a child anticipate a lot of what they're going to be expected to do. So even things like having them do ordering for themselves in restaurants. I find kids who have slower language processing, their parents speak a lot for them. And sometimes that's okay, but other times it doesn't give them that practice to be able to do that. Now, they may have trouble with that. So let's just take an example of you're going to a restaurant. Again, when we are able to go to restaurants again with your child, and it takes him a long time to peruse the menu. It takes him a long time to come up with what he wants. And then the waitress comes and he's got to have the words to actually express what it is that he wants. Well, have him practice that before. If you're going to a certain kind of restaurant, say, you know what, you like the chicken pieces and you like the hamburgers, start to think about now what you want so that when the waitress comes, you'll be able to say what you want. So think about all of the different situations that your child might be in a normal kind of culture, and have him anticipate that. Have her think about what it is she wants. And so I've got a few other examples here. The other thing that I want to make a point of is I've always suggested that kids who have language processing problems make a really good eye contact with someone as they're speaking. And for the most part, that does tend to be true. However, I've had other kids say to me that it's too much information to come in at one time. So they like to kind of, here's what somebody's saying, look down and concentrate, and then look up. So you want to make sure when you're asking your child to do some of these things that it's actually helping. That's one of those things that I recommended regardless. And for some kids, it's not necessarily a help. So then what can we do at home? Okay, one of the things you can do in terms of language is to change the way you talk at home, modify how quickly you're saying things, modify the tone and the complexity of what you're saying. If you've got more emotions coming at your child, they've got to process two things. They have to process the words and they have to process the emotions. And that makes it doubly hard for them to then figure out what it is you're saying and come up with a response. Also, you want to make sure that you keep things the same time, the same place, the same. We are much more efficient at processing and being able to express ourselves if everything else is consistent. And I have here a little graph that in one of my studies, we found that these were the sorts of things that were problematic for parents who had children with slower language processing. So it's just something to keep in mind that this is something that really affects your home life. The other thing too that I wanted to mention, and then I'll get to your questions, is remember to watch the clock. So keeping track of time doesn't seem like it's related to language processing, but it really is. One of the most important things that speech and language therapists do to help kids who have trouble with language processing is to help them organize their language system. So they help them learn that different things come in different categories and how then to organize the information that's coming in. And one of the ways that you can do that, even if you're not a speech and language person, is to help your child learn what time is. Recent research has shown that kids with ADHD have trouble with time perception, meaning they have trouble figuring out what does 5 minutes feel like versus 30 minutes. That's hard for them. They don't perceive time as someone who doesn't have ADHD. We tend to think this might be true for all kids who have trouble with processing information. And I have met lots of honor students in high school who do not know the months of the year and what order they're in. They cannot read an analog clock. So anything you can do to infuse organization into your child's world will go out into the language system. So I am really a huge believer in teaching your child how to read an analog clock because they're seeing time pass. And they're seeing time in chunks. It's a visual representation. Otherwise, all they're seeing is just, 3:55. That doesn't mean anything. But really using an analog clock and referring to it is very important. Doesn't seem to apply to language structure, but it really does. So the other thing that you might want to think about too is to as you're acknowledging the problem, look at your other family members. What is the match here? Are you a fast talker and your child isn't? Is everyone in your family sort of struggling with language processing? It's really good to share some of your experiences with your child, but also if there's a lot of differences in the family, you want to make sure that you find a way to match everyone's language processing. And also minimizing other kinds of family stressors. So we know that when stress levels get high, our speed of processing, our speed of being able to take information goes way down. And that's because our nervous system, when we're stressed, is primed for the most important things that are coming. And so complicated language is not something that a nervous system is primed for when it's nervous. And then remember, I said something about advocacy. That's really all about educating yourself about your child's specific disabilities, also helping your child have the words to describe it. Identifying the problem makes you more empowered. It makes you better able to talk to your child's teacher, or if you are a teacher, better able to teach to that child's strength while remediating what they need. And that brings me again, just one last point about the speech and language therapist. I mentioned that they are very much involved in helping kids organize their language structure. And some of the things that they will be doing are things like expressive language activities, being able to help them be more fluent. Sometimes they also work on articulation, but that's typically not what we're talking about. But if you've got a child who also has an articulation problem and a language processing problem, you want to make sure that you're doing everything you can to make their articulation as good as possible. And then they might be working on comprehension. How do we understand what's coming in? Sometimes for younger kids, it can be as simple as understanding really what they call the W questions: who, why, what, where. What is it that someone is asking when they're asking you a particular kind of question? And that's another way, when I was saying that they help them organize their language structure. Is it a why question? Is it a who question? What do you need to know in order to answer those sorts of questions? And then sometimes they work on pragmatic languages activities, working on the social aspect of language. So I will stop right there. I know that I talk very fast. I do have a book that I have written called Bright Kids Who Can't Keep Up, and it talks a lot about just general processing speed. But because language is so crucial, it's really when we're talking about processing speed in this sort of term, we're not really talking about processing speed as far as how fast you can run or how fast you can hit a ball or your reaction time. We're really talking about processing and being in an environment. For that, we're really talking about language processing, communication, understanding, and output. So I'll stop right there and take some questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Braaten, for that presentation. It was absolutely fascinating. And we do have a number of questions, so I will do my best to get the most frequent ones asked and answered here. So I'll start with some of the brass tacks, and that was parents who are recognizing some familiar signs, and they're wondering how early, how young can a parent pursue an evaluation for their child?
So when we're talking about language processing, it's such an important aspect of development that I don't really think any time is too young. And if you've got a 2-year-old who is having trouble with expressive language, you can get an evaluation through the early intervention program in your local school system or county, however your state manages that. And it's never really too young if you're worried about language. It's not like other aspects of behavior or academics. So, if you've got a child who you're worried about might have dyslexia, I would say, wait till 5, 6, 7. But language is something that we can really evaluate and determine whether or not a child is at risk for future problems. And sometimes even just 5 or 6 or 10 or 12 sessions with a speech and language therapist at age 3 or 4 can go a long way in preventing future problems.
That's wonderful. That answers for a lot of people here. And we got a number that were sort of heartbreaking. I'm going to read one of them, and it's a little down the timeline. Can you insist on an evaluation in the high school years? My son's school seems to think it's too late.
Yes, you can insist, and no, it's not too late. And I'm frustrated. It's heartbreaking, but I'm also frustrated for this parent. It's absolutely not. It's your right to request an evaluation. And there are so many things that can be done with high school students. And especially when high school students, the thing is they've had a lifetime perhaps of not feeling competent, but they also have their future ahead of them. And so you can use this time as a way of saying to them, listen, I want to help you figure out where to go from here. Let's use this. Sometimes high school students don't want to get evaluated themselves, but you definitely have the right to ask for that from your local public school. And you can also talk to your pediatrician. And if the school's not doing a competent job, and you can always get an advocate or a lawyer to help you with that. But you can also go through your insurance or get a private evaluation and talk to your pediatrician as to whether or not that's possible.
Wonderful. We did have a few adults as well who wondered if an evaluation in the adult years, and just based on what you were saying about self-esteem and anxiety and all of the trickle-down effects, if you will, that it would absolutely, in a similar vein, be worth an evaluation.
Absolutely, it would be worth an evaluation. And I would go to a speech and language therapist. I mean, you could go to an adult neuropsychologist. And ironically, sometimes neuropsychological testing is covered as an adult, even though it's not as a child. And not to worry you at all, but partly it's because the adult brain ages. And so that's considered a medical kind of evaluation, as opposed to when a child is struggling with language, they consider it developmental. And so, either they'll grow out of it or they can get this taken care of by the school. So you might be actually eligible through your insurance to get an evaluation that's paid for. You might have to wait a while for it, but it really can be very illuminating and very interesting. And one thing to consider is when I started studying processing speed and researching the book that came out, I think it's been out now 5 or 6 years, I didn't have anything to look at when it came to processing speed and children. And I had to look at the adult literature. So there's a lot of information out there about adults and processing speed because they studied it based on the aging brain or adults who had had a stroke or had some kind of head trauma, for example. So that's where I had to start looking. Now we've got a lot more information about processing speed and language processing and different kinds of processing in kids, but it's only been in the last 10 years. I would definitely think it would be a good idea. And you could either go to a speech and language therapist who specializes in adults or a neuropsychologist who specializes in adults.
Wonderful. That's very helpful. We had a lot of questions. Along that vein, a lot of people asking where to go, but similarly, wondering if there is a specific test instrument or specific evaluation that they should request for their child and or for themselves. We have a number of people who say that their child was evaluated, diagnosed with something else, a lot of dyslexia, ADHD, of course, but they really feel like there's still something else there. So they're basically wondering about a reevaluation, and is there a specific instrument they should request?
No, the good news and the bad news is that it's no. I mean, the bad news is that it would be so much easier if I could say, yes, there's this one test that will just tell you everything. It doesn't. But that's also the good news, because we want to get a broad battery of tests. And there are lots of different tests of language functioning, and a good evaluator goes into an evaluation. So when I evaluate a child, I am listening to what the parent is saying as the primary issue. I want to make sure I evaluate that. But as I'm evaluating a child, I'm thinking, I didn't expect that child to have problems with memory, I'm going to bring in some more memory tests here. So that's what a good evaluator should be doing. Now, school psychologists are restricted. I mean, they don't have as much time. They don't even have access to all the materials that you might have in a private practice. So we can't fault school psychologists or speech and language therapists who work in the school at all. They're working with what they have. However, you still have the right to get answers as a parent. So one of the things you want to do is you want to be very specific about your question. So when you say my question isn't answered, no, like whatever it is, Billy takes 5 minutes to come up with a response. What is that? And if you've already had an evaluation, say, where is it in the evaluation that would answer that question? And if they cannot tell you, then say, I want a battery of tests that will give me an answer to that. So it's better to ask for a battery of tests that look at expressive language, receptive language, working memory, processing speed at a very minimum. And then I would also add to that other kinds of executive functions like being able to organize and what we call shift set. So go from one thing to the next. And then also things like pragmatic language. So the ability to sort of understand and empathize with others, again, in a time frame. Oftentimes they're very empathic kids, but they don't quite get it at the time that they're supposed to be getting this. So it's much better to think about asking for a battery of tests. And if you've had a broad battery of tests for your child and they did not give an intelligence test or intelligence battery, you want to make sure that's part of it too, because that gives you a lot of information. So when I'm talking about intelligence batteries, I'm talking about the Wechsler scale. So it's either the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, which we abbreviate as the WISC. That's for school-age kids all the way up to age 16. The WIPC, which is the preschool version of that, up to age 6. And it can even be given up to age 7. And then and then the adult version, 16 and up, is the WACE. So you want to make sure that one of those tests was given, or there are two other options. One is the differential ability scale, which is also a good measure, kind of global cognitive processing, and that's abbreviated the DAS. And also a lot of times schools will give the Woodcock-Johnson tests of cognitive abilities. But if you're really curious, I mean, probably the number one test that you want, if you've got a child who has some kind of learning or attention kind of issue, you want to make sure at one time in their school history that they've received a WISC or a WIPC or a WACE.
That is so valuable. All of that about requesting the battery and the specific test that answers so many questions that we've received today. And it underscores another theme here, which is comorbidities. So, I mean, dozens and dozens of questions today asking if language processing overlaps with dyslexia, dysgraphia, nonverbal learning disability disorder, auditory processing disorder, autism. I think the short answer is yes. Yes.
That's why a broad evaluation, a broad battery of tests is important, because what a good evaluator is doing is that he or she is seeing how these aspects fit together. So in every one of those disorders that you mentioned, language is part of that disorder. For autism, we tend to see problems with language processing, with different ways of communicating, and particularly with social pragmatic language, not understanding how to communicate with others in a socially appropriate manner. With dyslexia, we tend to find more problems in written language, of course, that's part of it. But oftentimes we find even if kids don't meet criteria for another formal language disorder, we tend to find in high percentages of kids with dyslexia problems with just general language processing. Again, it may not meet the criteria for a disorder, but they have trouble more than you would expect because of the dyslexia and for various kinds of reasons, but also it's just something to think about. ADHD, where we find kids with ADHD tend to have problems organizing their thoughts or getting their thoughts on paper. So all of these things do have a language component. That's why it's important to get a broad evaluation to say, okay, so my child has autism, for example. What does that mean for his language system? How would you expect communication to be affected by autism in general, but for my child particularly? You also mentioned nonverbal learning disability, which you'd think wouldn't affect verbal because it's nonverbal learning disability. But really, kids with nonverbal learning disabilities, they're very good verbally in some ways, fabulous vocabulary, sometimes able to talk at a really high level with adults and far beyond their years, but they may have trouble comprehending certain kinds of situations or certain kinds of language. So these are things to keep in mind. But yes. So if you've got a child who's already been diagnosed with one of these things and you listen to this, you're like, maybe it's not dyslexia, maybe it's this. It's more likely it's both. I would not think that the disorder itself would change, but that this is another layer in understanding what that disorder might mean for your child's ability to communicate.
Right. Excellent point. And you made the point earlier that some of the language processing challenges, like trouble with timed tests, that's not really going to reveal itself until middle school and high school. So, right, it's an ever expanding picture.
That's right. And I think we have to think about that too, that even in our current the way we sort of think in psychology and psychiatry about diagnoses are changing a lot. One is that we realize that these things change over the course of a lifetime. So sometimes a child who meets criteria for dyslexia at age, let's say second grade, we remediate the dyslexia, and by ninth grade, that child might meet criteria for dysgraphia. That doesn't mean that the original diagnosis was wrong. It just means that these are disorders that develop over time. And like you said, there are certain things that a child's not even asked to do that at a certain age. And the same thing is that we're starting to look at disorders cross-diagnostically, meaning that attention seems to be important for a number of disorders, or language is important for a number of disorders. And maybe the categories we use they're sometimes very helpful, because we know if a child is diagnosed with dyslexia, we know exactly the sorts of things that fix it. And the same go for things like autism. But maybe those disorders that we're using aren't broad enough, or we're not thinking cross-diagnostically or across different categories at the underlying skills that are necessary for successful, adulthood and school performance.
That's fascinating, isn't it? Yeah. We are almost out of time, but I wanted to just piggyback on that with what I think is a really important last question. And that is, do you have any advice for parents how to explain processing speed, maybe more generally, but language processing challenges to their children in a way that will not further impair their self-esteem, that will actually feel so that they feel empowered to self-advocate?
Yes, you brought up a really good point. And I'm sorry I didn't bring this up before. One of the things you want to just tell them is to make it normal. Our world is interesting and fun, and it makes life worth living because we're all so different. And you want to convey that to your child, that everybody does things at different rates. Some people talk fast, some people run fast, and some people don't. And that doesn't mean that they're any worse off. It's just different. And the world needs thinkers, and they need fast people. We need people to work in the emergency room, and then we need poets, and we need, all sorts of things in between. And so you want to convey this to your child in a way that is makes them think that what they have is kind of special and that it's valuable. Like, I always bring this up almost every time I talk, in that they're kind of the Buddhas of our world, or that we try so hard in our lives to slow down and to take time to think about what it is we want to say. When you think about in life, we get in trouble because we say things too quickly or we say too much. So these kids have a lot to teach us, and we have to just be able to empower them that, I like your way of thinking. And I want to support you in being able to do that more efficiently in a way that doesn't frustrate you. But, it's okay to be kind of a dreamer, a thinker. And I feel like another thing you can say to kids is there's some people who do very good at looking at lots of things all at the same time quickly. And then there are other people who are they're just more equipped to do one thing really, really well. And I feel like kids who have speed fall in line with that kind of personality. And one last thing, because I know we're going over, is if you or somebody in your family has a similar sort of profile, it can be so empowering for kids to hear that they're not alone. You know what? This is who we are. We are our genes and our environment. And if you can say, I was just like you when I was a student. And if you're successful, share that with them. If you had trouble, share that with him and let him know why you're trying to make things more easy for him.
That is such a wonderful way to end. This was a fascinating topic and thoroughly enjoyed the presentation, Dr. Braaten. Thank you so much. And on behalf of our hundreds of thousands of listeners here today and lots of questions, thank you so much for joining Attitude and for contributing to this important topic. Yes. So I will wrap up here today. I just want to remind everyone your book is titled Bright Kids Who Can't Keep Up. So a lot of people asking what to do next. That would be a great next step. And of course, Attitude offers more webinars on all sorts of topics. And our next one is actually later this week on Thursday, January 28th on a very different topic, but also important, time management in the pandemic, better productivity, even when every day could be Monday. So we hope you will join us again at Attitude for our ADHD Expert Series. And Dr. Braaten, thank you so much for your time and expertise today.
You're very welcome.
Take care.